It's a real pleasure now to introduce you to our second keynote for the day, Darren Sharp. And I think I've been following Darren on social media forever and watching this emergence of these ideas around how we think about the commons. So I'm really excited to hear you talk today, Darren. Darren's a leading sharing economy consultant and researcher. He's the director of Social Surplus, where he works with a range of clients to design programs that amplify the strengths of people and communities, and especially around envisaging the transition to socially just and sustainable futures. He's the convener of the Australian Platform, Cooperativism Working Group and a steering group of New Economy Network Australia. He's co-authored the book Sharing Cities, which you can have a look at over lunch and purchase, which looks at 137 different case studies of policies to look at how city residents are using commons-based strategies to meet their needs, and currently completing his PhD on urban experimentation for sustainability at Curtin University. Please welcome me in, or please join me in welcoming Darren.
I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Kaurna people, the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to thank Tim Mayers and IPA for inviting me here today, also the Entrepreneurship Community of Practice, and thank you to Athena and team for putting on such a wonderful event today. And of course, thanks to all of you for being here and giving of your time. Today I'm here to talk about reimagining the commons for the new economy. If we think about green space, critical infrastructure like the World Wide Web, open software and local skills, these are all part of the commons and provide essential shared resources which none of us owns, but that we all rely on to thrive. My presentation today will showcase how the commons is being reimagined as communities and entrepreneurs come together to steward shared assets and infrastructure to support the common good. I'll introduce you to case studies from around the world and demonstrate how entrepreneurs are playing a key role in enabling and connecting these assets to support new forms of governments, public entrepreneurship and local economic development. For those of you joining us at the workshop after lunch, we'll be looking at how entrepreneurs can support grassroots innovations that connect stuff, space and skills in local communities and create commons-based solutions to a range of challenges. My colleague Ian McBurney will be joining me to demonstrate a case study of Australia's first platform cooperative Beehive Bendigo, a sharing economy platform owned and governed by the people of Bendigo. So please do join us for that session after lunch upstairs in the gallery. So what are we actually talking about here when we mention the commons? So commons advocate David Bollier has described the commons as the wealth that we inherit or create together and must pass on undiminished or enhanced to our children. Our collective wealth includes the gifts of nature, civic infrastructure, cultural works, traditions and knowledge. The commons is often hiding in plain sight. We don't think about it in our day-to-day travels through life. To quote Jonathan Rowe, everywhere present but rarely noticed, it provides the basic support systems of life, both ecological and social. It's the vast realm that is the shared heritage of all of us that we typically use without toll or price. The atmosphere and oceans, languages and culture, the stores of human knowledge and wisdom, the informal support systems of community, the peace and quiet that we crave, the genetic building blocks of life. These are all aspects of the commons. Elinor Ostrom, probably one of the most famous thought leaders in this space, her Nobel Prize-winning work on governing common pool resources demonstrated through decades of empirical research that humans have cooperated to collectively manage forests, water systems, fisheries, and other natural resources for centuries and beyond. These non-market forms of provisioning and resource management rely on basic design principles, which Ostrom observed in hundreds of communities around the world. These design principles relate to clearly defined group boundaries, rules of use, access and stewardship of common goods, matched to local needs, allowing those affected by the rules to modify them, graduated sanctions for rule breakers, and that commons are part of larger nested systems of shared authority that function through what's known as polycentric governance. Garrett Hardin's famous 1968 article, The Tragedy of the Commons, has had a huge influence on the study of the commons and the way we perceive and imagine the commons. His imagined scene, not based on any empirical research, based on basically a scenario that he developed and put out there in this famous article, imagines a scene of peasants sharing an open access field, each acting in their own self-interest, putting as many sheep to graze in the field as possible until the land is completely degraded, has captured people's imagination, but for all the wrong reasons. To quote Hess, as Ostrom and many others have pointed out, commons are not open access. People do communicate. People are able to self-govern resources, and people can and often do act for the common good or for the good of the resource. It is said there is no commons without commoning. This means that resources or gifts by themselves do not constitute a commons. These must be activated by community action and governance mechanisms. Again, the commons is neither the resource, the community that gathers around it, nor the protocols for its stewardship, but the dynamic interaction between all of these elements working together. As the Peer-to-Peer Foundation reminds us in this example here from Wikipedia, the resource is the encyclopedia entries. The community is comprised of all the content contributors, authors and editors from around the world. And the set of rules is the content and editing guidelines, which keeps Wikipedia operating so effectively. In this additional example, the resource is a national forest, this time here in the States, in Oregon. The community is made up of loggers, scientists and rangers, all key stakeholders in its watershed council. And the set of rules is the charter for co-managing the forest. And the important point here that the commons emerges from all of three interacting together. In recent years, we've seen the emergence of a variety of new commons or non-traditional common pool resources, such as knowledge commons like open source software communities. You can see some examples there. Infrastructure commons like the World Wide Web Consortium, which governs the protocols for the global web. Cultural commons, including music, food, language. Neighbourhood commons, like the explosion of community gardens and urban agriculture initiatives, tool libraries, and many others that we see springing up in communities all around the world. These are all socially constructed resources that don't appear naturally in the environment. To quote Hess again, these new commons seek to provide an alternative to the private-public government binary of governance solutions. These new kinds of commons focus on communities working together in self-governing ways to protect resources from enclosure or to build newly open shared resources. The enclosure of the commons is a recurring threat and happens when private sector interests, often working with the support of government, privatise or convert shared resources into private resources and treat them as tradable commodities, to quote David Bollier. Enclosure of the commons has been going on for centuries. If we think back at the English enclosure movement from centuries ago, where the king and aristocracy stole the pastures, forests, water and grazing lands used by commoners and declared them private property. Today, we see a variety of new enclosure movements as Silicon Valley firms, again, with the support of governments, use proprietary platforms and network effects to extract and commodify our data and take over critical city infrastructure under the rhetoric of disruptive innovation, the smart city, the sharing economy. Google is now in the city building business, as seen by the Toronto waterfront redevelopment under its subsidiary Sidewalk Labs. This so-called smart city plan involves creating a neighbourhood from the internet up, according to their PR brochures, powered and served by data with sensors monitoring everything from air quality to pedestrian traffic, even the flushing of toilets. Enclosure of the commons erodes community by turning citizens into consumers and creates vendor lock-in and walled gardens which undermine democracy by colonising our public space with proprietary platforms which constantly monitor our behaviour and commodify our data. Colonises our mental space as well through algorithm-led social media platforms which track us around the web to deliver unwanted advertising and fake news powered by AI and machine learning. But it doesn't have to be this way. The city is also an important platform for commoning practices as communities come together to steward a range of shared urban resources, including everything from physical commons like public space, vacant land and underutilised buildings. Think about 3,000 acres, a social enterprise in Melbourne, which works with public and private sector actors to unlock vacant land for community gardens and urban agriculture in the city and for community development initiatives. There are also many important cultural commons. Being from Melbourne, I'll give another Melbourne example. If we think about the really rich street art culture that we have in Melbourne, which attracts vast numbers of international and domestic tourists, it still amazes me every time I walk through the laneways and seeing everyone snapping away at the graffiti on the wall, which is, culturally, globally significant street art, which brings a lot of people. Now imagine if these shared spaces were enclosed, and imagine if we had to pay to access those spaces, either as citizens or as artists. There are also many democratic commons, like participatory budgeting and citizen juries, which strengthen the public sphere. Think about the Fund My Neighbourhood initiative here in South Australia. There are digital commons, like Barcelona's City Data Commons, which treat this important asset class as a shared resource to increase collaboration within government and between government and citizens. When you see the city as a commons, you realise that our urban environments are much more than just spaces for work and for consumption. To say that the city is a commons is to suggest that the city is a shared resource, open to, shared with and belonging to many types of people. That's a quote from Foster and Ione, who run LabGov in Italy. They're two leading legal scholars who've done more than many others to actually advance Elinor Ostrom's work and apply it to urban environments, which, unlike natural resource commons, are socially constructed and require some involvement from the market and also from government authorities as well. Through their empirical research, Foster and Ione have found that urban commons require resource pooling and cooperation between 5 types of actors. Social innovators, these include active citizens, digital collaboratives, community gardeners and so on. Public authorities, businesses, civil society organisations and knowledge institutions, whether at universities, schools, cultural institutions, museums and so on. The new Sharing Cities book from Shareable contains dozens of detailed case studies of communities governing the city as a commons. As we know, cities are where we experience some of the most urgent challenges we face today, including everything from rising inequality, social isolation, climate change. And to meet these challenges head on, empowered communities, organisations and governments are sharing their labour, knowledge, stuff, space and skills to overcome scarcity and to create abundance by building and maintaining vital common resources. They're showing how sharing leads everyone to have more together. I'm very proud to be part of an international team that wrote the book Sharing Cities Activating the Urban Commons. We've handpicked dozens of examples from all around the world. There were 11 chapters on housing, mobility, food, work, energy, land, waste, water, technology, finance and governments. And we're seeing everything from repair cafes and participatory budgeting projects to community-owned energy infrastructure, resident-managed public spaces and taxi cooperatives. There's almost no service that can't be run democratically by citizens for each other. And as mentioned, the book is available for sale and I'll be happy to have a chat to you during lunch and do some book signings as well. Sharing cities are really a growing trend. We're now seeing a number of city governments beginning to play an active role by formally declaring themselves as sharing cities in recognition that making their assets and their infrastructure more amenable to sharing can drive positive social, economic and environmental benefits. Seoul became the world's first sharing city in 2012 and introduced quite comprehensive legislation to support the local sharing ecosystem. They've opened up around 800 of their public buildings for use during idle hours so the community group, the social sector can get access to those spaces when staff are not there. They fund local sharing organisations that are committed to solving urban challenges, and they run a startup school to nurture the next generation of sharing entrepreneurs. Amsterdam became Europe's first sharing city in 2012. They convened an ambassador group comprised of diverse stakeholders from the corporate, knowledge and public sectors who agree to prototype sharing city solutions and demonstrate the potential of sharing to deliver public good outcomes in cities. Charles mentioned this, I was pleased to see in his talk earlier this morning. Bologna, one of the best examples of the city as a commons is the city of Bologna's regulation on collaboration between citizens and the city for the care and regeneration of urban commons. But I think Charles had it down right when he said the Bologna Regulation 2014. It's much easier to say. Provides a really interesting history-making institutional innovation and enables Bologna to operate as an urban commons. Neil Gorenflow from Shareable tells a story of how in 2011 a group of women in Bologna wanted to donate benches to their neighbourhood park, Piazza Carducci, and to quote Neil, there was nowhere to sit in the park. They called the city government to get permission to put in the benches. They called one department, referred them on to another department. No one in the city could help them. This highlighted a dilemma. There simply was no way for citizens to contribute improvements to the city, and in fact, it was illegal to do so. Developed over the preceding years with the work of much research and scholarship and community activation and the work of active citizens, and importantly, the Mayor's Office and the local government, the Bologna Regulation now supports active citizens to co-lead commoning in the city through collaboration agreements. This is an instrument that aligns deliberative processes and intent with a legal contract between citizens and the municipality. At a legislative level, the Bologna Regulation enables active citizens to approach local government and establish civic agreements to co-govern public space, parks, vacant land or buildings. And there's now over 280 of these citizen-led projects for urban improvement, which are happening across Bologna. This is a couple of examples here. An ethical boutique that was set up by a women's association to support asylum seekers. They were given access by the city to an underutilised public building, and they've set up that ethical boutique. They volunteer their time and their skills using a public asset to support a social cause. Another example is Social Streets, which was launched to help residents get to know one another and to build a hyper-local network, face-to-face community of practice in local neighbourhoods to come together and work on projects of common interest. That model has now spread to hundreds of other cities around the world in the years since it was launched, but started in Bologna. Ghent is another really fascinating example. In Belgium, there are about 500 urban commons projects which are thriving. Examples here include Nest, which is a former library turned into an urban commons lab. Neighbours of the Abbey is a former church building publicly controlled by the local community. Dreammaster Park is a community-managed park which sits on a former industrial site in a poor neighbourhood which is managed by local residents. A new research report led by Michelle Bowens from the Peer-to-Peer Foundation shows that within the last 10 years, the city has seen a tenfold increase in local commons initiatives. With a population of less than 250,000, Ghent is sizably smaller than other more well-known sharing cities like Seoul and Amsterdam, but this report shows how it's quickly becoming a hub of some of the most innovative urban commons projects in the world today. Returning to the insight that there is no commons without commoning, it is worth reiterating that governing the city as a commons requires polycentric governance between diverse stakeholders operating at different levels. To quote Foster and Ione again, in many of these examples, users work with government, agencies and public officials to design, enforce and monitor the rules for using and managing the resource. This kind of decision-making is referred to as polycentric governance, to capture the idea that while the government remains an essential player in facilitating, supporting and even supplying the necessary tools and assets to govern shared resources, the government is not the monopoly decision-maker. Polycentric systems can also unlock what Ostrom referred to as public entrepreneurship, or also known as social innovation, which involves the co-design of community services at the city or neighbourhood level to create an array of common goods and the activation and empowerment of citizens. It's also an important reframing from understanding people as city users towards seeing them as city makers. If we choose to look at the new economy through a commons-based lens, we see thousands of cases of public entrepreneurship and social innovation happening around the world, in everything from repair cafes, which match people who've got broken items, appliances which need to be fixed with people who have those skills to repair those appliances in local communities, to all the thousands of urban agriculture, urban farming and community gardening projects which are happening, to maker spaces. This photo here is from one in Melbourne, which is at Library at the Dock, which is a City of Melbourne facility. So it's actually at the library, and they've created a really amazing maker space where you can actually learn about 3D printing, you can actually get involved in open hardware design and acquire new skills for the new economy. And it's also about tool libraries, which again are popping up in communities around the world, where citizens can pool their resources and have access to those resources without having to own them. It's what happens when people make the conscious choice to become empowered, to play to their strengths, and come together in solidarity with workmates, friends and neighbours to make change happen in local communities. Platform cooperatives are a new form of enterprise that treat work as a commons. These are concerned with protecting the financial interests and livelihoods of people who create value in the new economy through collective ownership and democratic governance. To quote this article here from Shareable, a platform co-op is a digital platform, a website or a mobile app which is designed to provide a service or sell a product that's collectively owned and governed by the people who depend on and participate in it. That includes those who deliver the underlying service by contributing their labour, time, skills and/or assets. Some examples include Stocksy United. If you think about iStock Photo or Getty Images, Stocksy offers a similar type of stock photography platform, except in this case, they're an artist-owned cooperative. They're based in Canada. They're founded on principles of equality, respect, and fair distribution of profits. So unlike photographers using those other platforms, in the case of Stocksy United, when a stock item is sold, a photo is sold, the artist receives 50% of a standard license purchase, and then every single co-op member also receives a share of the company and can get involved in the governance of that company if they so choose, of the organisation if they so choose. Another example is Green Taxi Co-op. This is in the US. It offers the same convenience and functionality of, let's say, Uber or Lyft, but it's a driver-owned worker cooperative. It has 800 driver owners, which have captured about 40% of market share of the Denver Boulder metro taxi cab market. And this model empowers drivers, it keeps profits and decision-making in the hands of local service providers. Closer to home, Beehive, which we're going to hear from later on today in the workshop with Ian McBurney after lunch, is a sharing economy platform owned and governed by the local community. Once fully operational, Beehive members will be able to share a variety of assets, stuff, space and skills. Beehive is Australia's first platform cooperative and applies democratic ownership and governance to digital platforms to ensure that the technology, the data and the transactions facilitated by Beehive generates local economic development and creates multiplier effects by keeping money and decision-making in the hands of that local community. And I know that they're very keen to spread that model to other communities and other cities around Australia and beyond. So please, join myself and Ian after lunch to hear more about that model and to help to figure out ways that we can co-design ideas to help entrepreneurs connect stuff, space and skills to democratise innovation in the new economy. Another example of commons-based entrepreneurship is a trend called Design Global, Manufacture Local. Its key insight is that what is light, such as code, software, knowledge, should be global, and what is heavy, such as physical goods for manufacturing and so on, should be local. It's a form of distributed manufacturing, but it leverages commons-based peer production, the type of stuff that we've seen in the open source software communities, open code, knowledge and design, to produce circulatory value. It also sources local resources in close proximity of intended use to create efficient supply chains and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This is a really wonderful example, which I believe started in the UK. For those of you who are fans of Indy Johar's work, I think he is involved in setting this project up amongst many other amazing groundbreaking projects. So WikiHouse is a collaborative R&D project, and it's really kickstarting a digital revolution in how we make homes. So essentially you can get access to a global commons of designs for these homes, download those open source designs and then print off those literally pieces of wood there which are laser cut using CNC cutters and so on, and then non-expert builders can knock that up together in a day or so. So you can obviously see examples where there's crisis accommodation that's needed, where there's disaster areas and so on, where accommodation needs to be brought together really quickly. In Australia, though, this is particularly an acute issue given the housing affordability crisis, and anything that we can do to reduce the cost of housing, I think, is something that we should pay attention to. And WikiHouse is definitely leading the way in helping us reframe and understand housing. AbilityMate is another good example of commons-based entrepreneurship. These guys are based in Sydney. They're using 3D printing and co-design to create customised assistive devices for people with disabilities. They design open source hardware solutions. They release their blueprints and their code to cultivate global collaboration, transparency and ongoing innovation. And their model applies to many different types of custom-made products. And they've decided to begin with a focus on one of the greatest need areas, custom-made ankle-foot orthoses for children. As you can see, an image of that being fitted there. One of the main points I'd like to make today is that reimagining the commons for the new economy means recognising entrepreneurs, all of you here today, as key enablers of these new commons. Public or social entrepreneurs need dedicated entrepreneurs that are able to connect common pool resources, communities of commoners, and to help co-design sets of rules through polycentric governance. And being an enabling partner often means letting go. Polycentric governance cannot happen without entrepreneurs. The key insights here are that polycentric governance requires a facilitator state. This could often be a local government as well in many cases, which redistributes decision-making power and influence away from the centre and towards an engaged public. This requires a new vision of government as collaborator and enabling partner, and it requires shared responsibility of caring for common goods with active citizens together. One of the main ways that entrepreneurs can support grassroots innovation and public entrepreneurship is by connecting stuff, space and skills, and I'd like to now briefly share with you some of the best practice examples of what this looks like in action. So in terms of sharing stuff, Barcelona Council's City Data Commons will approach data as a common asset to guarantee technological sovereignty and privacy, which is acutely important in light of the growing power of social media and digital platforms who sell user data, which is then used to shape opinion in the public sphere and so on. Given that data is a key asset class, Barcelona recognised that it's key to the city's infrastructure and can be used to reach better, faster and more democratic decisions, to incubate innovation, to improve public services and to empower the community. In terms of sharing space, I already mentioned that through the Sharing City Seoul initiative, the Seoul Metropolitan Government has opened up 800 of its public buildings for use during idle hours, and these have been utilised over 22,000 times by Seoul citizens since the program was launched. Infrastructure for sharing, making and repair is also really key here, and the city of Malmö in Sweden have recognised this by converting underutilised space and vacant buildings into a makerspace, which we can see in the centre there, which enables local residents to come together and develop new skills and enterprises for the new economy. They've also developed a bike kitchen for bicycle repair and maintenance, a textile workshop and an education centre, amongst many other projects. All of these initiatives feed into Malmö's vision of becoming a sustainable city that supports innovation in the new economy. In terms of skills, support and services, Seoul, again, runs a sharing economy startup schools, which reviews business ideas around the sharing economy, supports up-and-coming sharing entrepreneurs, and provides startup consulting through weekly workshop sessions, and has been in operation since 2013. The Participatory City project in London, through its Everyone Every Day initiative, is growing a network of projects and businesses across Barking and Dagenham over the next 5 years. It's a really ambitious project that aims to work with all the creativity and energy that already exists in the communities. So Everyone Every Day will invite people to suggest ideas for projects and businesses they'd like to create. And what they're actually doing is opening up 5 high street shops and a central warehouse with free co-working and maker spaces, with shared kitchens, all of this to support the local community. From these core spaces, The project team will then support the local community to create projects to arrange insurance, health and safety, hold festivals, workshop, and a business development incubator. In Barcelona, we see collaborative policy development initiatives like Procomans really being innovative. They're developing policies for the sharing economy with the community to look at both the potential for the sharing economy but also its challenges. So Procomans has been established to define public policies that could help promote the commons side of the sharing economy in Barcelona. So following discussions at the first event in 2016, where more than 400 participants gathered, a range of experts, citizens and sector representatives, 120 policy recommendations were collaboratively developed, then submitted to the local government, and then Barcelona City Council, through its municipal action plan, is following a consultative online participatory process to see how those proposals can be implemented. I'd like to finish my presentation today with a call to action and to reiterate that entrepreneurs are key enablers of the commons. Collaborative governance of the commons requires a new relationship between government and community, and entrepreneurs have an important role to play in creating that new relationship. Entrepreneurs are needed to connect common pool resources for innovation, as the case with Barcelona's Open Data Commons, to connect communities together for co-production and public entrepreneurship, as the case with the infrastructure for sharing, making and repair that I showed you that's happening in Malmö in Sweden, to co-create sets of rules for managing shared resources, as the case with Procomans collaborative policy development happening in Barcelona, and to foster new relationships through polycentric governance, as we can see with the Bologna regulation to support the urban commons. Entrepreneurs work together with active citizens as an enabling partner to help steward and support the various commons-based initiatives I've shared with you today. So I hope that this news story about the commons has resonated with you and, more importantly, given you a new lens from which to see how entrepreneurs such as yourselves can play an essential role in supporting the new economy through commons-based approaches. If you're interested in applying some of these insights, I encourage you to join Ian McBurney and myself after lunch upstairs in the gallery, where we'll be inviting you to develop ideas for how to democratise innovation and connect stuff, space and skills to support grassroots projects and public entrepreneurship in local communities. And finally, a reminder that my new book, Sharing Cities, Activating the Urban Commons, is available for purchase during lunch. Thank you again. I hope you enjoyed my talk, and I hope you enjoy the rest of today's program. Thank you.
Your first point about the commons being kind of comprised of resource, community, set of rules have got me thinking about how I apply that to MOD, you know, how we make a resource which is a museum for young people and how we create a commons around that. What we want that to be a participatory space, so how do we open that up? And I think that's a really interesting reflection on the type of conversations that we've been having. You know, we've been talking about public entrepreneurship is really about finding those cross-boundary solutions, and they're not just for the public sector, they're for the people that we work with and for. And so how do we start to create entrepreneurship with those people, I think, is the really interesting application of thinking about commons. How do we think about active citizens who are also proactively wanting to innovate and create change? And how do we help them to create freedom and time to do that? How do we help them find resources when there really are none? You know, how do we find those links? And how do we enable them to have networks in the same way that we might try and drive networks across our professional spectrum? And really that comes back to what you said, Darren, and also what you said this morning, Charles, which is around that open stance and how do you kind of open up those fuzzy boundaries at the edge? How do you relax control of stuff and space and skills to activate that space? And so I think for us as entrepreneurs within organisations, thinking about the people that we are trying to serve and how we relax those boundaries to include them in our network and our activation, and how we might create something richer out of that is a really good and interesting challenge. So I really appreciate your talk.